Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project, a platform for peer-to-peer conversations with the people that are helping to shape the carbon markets of tomorrow. Join me, Renee Velasquez, as I get to have conversations on topics ranging from ESG and finance over cocktails in the Lion City of Singapore. Cheers.
My guest today is David Antonioli, CEO at Vera. David is a seminal figure in the carbon markets, and after 15 years at the helm, he recently announced that he is stepping down from the leadership position in an announcement that surprised many in the market. I'm privileged enough to sit down with him during a recent visit to Singapore for his first on-camera interview after making his announcement. Join me as I ask David to reminisce about his journey and to reflect on his legacy in helping to shape environmental markets. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project.
David, welcome to Singapore, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no,
I've
thank
been
you.
really looking forward to our conversation. We're meeting today in Singapore in this beautiful bar, but we're meeting at a really interesting time in the market, right? And given the broader sort of macroeconomic kind of context, we've seen significant growth in the voluntary carbon markets over the last few years, 3 to 4 years. And then now we're seeing sort of this illiquidity in the market, right? And a number of essentially headwinds as a result of the broader macro picture, right? Rising rates, war in Ukraine, and effectively a risk-off kind of stance in financial markets. There's also been some media criticisms around voluntary carbon markets. So it's a really interesting time.
Yeah.
You sit at the head of the largest standard in the carbon markets. So you have a really interesting vantage point. I'd love to get your input and your perspective really on where do you see the market today and how do you see it evolving?
Yeah.
So open question to you.
This is a big question. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Likewise,
and to
man.
be here. What a great venue. Yes. You know, I think I always come back to the idea or the concept that at the core, these markets are doing good stuff, right?
Yeah.
We're facilitating investment in project activities that reduce or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. That's good. In many cases, it's driving really incredible and innovative development outcomes.
Absolutely.
And bringing new sorts of finance to that particular challenge. So,
and channeling finance efficiently to communities
exactly.
in particular, right?
Exactly, yes. And so I think that the fundamental logic of the market is very clear. And you're right. I think there are headwinds. I think, there will be times when there's a lot of excitement and a lot of growth, and there'll be times when it might be contract a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a logic to it, and I think it has an important role, and I think it's got potential to grow.
I completely agree. If I can interject, what I sense is this palpable. When I'm talking to a lot of finance folks, increasingly over the last few years, folks from investment banks and hedge funds and trading communities. What I sense from them is essentially an inevitability around carbon markets. Right. And so what you're talking about is essentially the cyclicality. Markets go up and they go down. Right now, as it ebbs and flows, essentially there's less liquidity than we had in 2021, say. But that's not a surprise, right? And essentially we're at this paradigm shift in terms of the market evolving. So, I find that to be a really interesting kind of time to live in. Right, and like you, I've been around in the markets for a while, right? And I've seen a couple of these ebbs and flows, right? And rise and then falls of the market. This time doesn't feel like that scary to me, right? When we look at the data, we look at issuance numbers. They're relatively close to what we've had over the last few years. So it's not like there's this, certainly not this exponential growth or like triple-digit growth that we saw year over year in 2019 to 2020. But 21 to 22, we saw growth. And then 22 to 23, maybe we see a little bit of a drop off, but it's not precipitous. Do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, I like you use the word inevitability. And I think that once, we're still grappling with the kind of the construct of the Paris Agreement, which is bottom up, which means like you and everybody else has to do something about this, right? It's not like someone's going to come down from on high and say, like, here are the rules, here are the regulations, and what you got to do. So we're making it up as we go along in many ways, kind of figuring out how this all works. And I think that there is an inevitability to thinking that, look, one of the key elements of how we address the climate crisis is that we drive investment to the lowest cost opportunities.
Yeah.
Which is really which then either reduces your overall costs, which is good, or it reduces your overall costs and allows you to mitigate more.
Completely.
And I think that you mentioned, the concerns about, the questions people have about integrity and stuff. I think that's always going to happen. I think the work that we do is abstract by nature.
Yeah.
So people can pick it apart. That's going to happen.
But it's not different to any other financial market. Right? Like, okay, this market is not nascent, but I think it's like in adolescence, right? So it's always evolving, it's always growing.
Exactly.
So integrity is paramount. It's actually baked into the core tenets of what standards do, right?
Yeah.
But that shifts over time, right? So famously, Vera came out in end of 2019, right, and implemented changes with regards to methodologies around renewables, right? And effectively not accepting new renewables projects from 1st of January 2020, right? So you ushered in this transition around kind of the additionality of these projects.
Yeah.
So that's an example of like inaction.
Yes.
Improvements of integrity over time. I remember when I first started in the market, renewables were all the rage.
Yeah.
The fundamentals around the financials, right? Like they were dependent heavily on the climate finance. That shifted, a few years ago. So you guys saw that coming into play. That's an example of kind of evolution of integrity in the market at work, but doesn't really get a lot of recognition, right?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. That we kind of don't talk about renewables very much anymore, and it's soon going to be in the rearview mirror, as you mentioned. But the other thing that I think is really telling about the experience with renewables is that it doesn't necessarily reflect an evolution of the market. I mean, of course it does, just because it's a big tectonic shift in terms of what's in and what's out.
Sure. But it's been certainly replaced by the nature-based side of things, right? So it's a transition.
But what I think is really important, and the story we've not been able to tell, is that in many ways, the renewable story is a success story.
Completely agree.
We should be celebrating the fact that, hey, these projects, I was looking at the numbers in China and India, the penetration of solar and wind, and it is flat in 2005. And then it goes through the roof.
Exponential.
And guess what happened in 2005? There's this thing called the Kyoto Protocol, right? Which then ran out of steam and had its own challenges, but then it continued under the voluntary market. And I think that we should be looking at renewables as a great example of how carbon can help drive transformation in specific sectors of the economy. And I think that's, to me, is the real core. If we can think about and really articulate the fact that these markets, and these credits, and these projects are helping to transform a sector, then I think we're onto something, because it really helps crystallize the value of this, because it's not just like, oh, you're going to invest in a project and get a credit. It's because you're actually driving change. And back to the development point I made, for many years I worked for a development agency. I worked for USAID. Yeah. And one of the key features of all development aid is that it depends on the political winds. So governments change, priorities shift, and guess what? This initiative that was being promoted all of a sudden is out of favor, and you got to wind it down. And this happens on a regular cycle because of changes in government. The same thing kind of happens with philanthropies. Philanthropies are always asking the donors, like, when are you going to wean yourself from the funds, et cetera. I mentioned this as an example yesterday, and so oh yeah, I remember that, like talking, I'm a grantee. And as soon as I get my proposal in to get the funding for the rest of the year, I now have to be thinking about the next funding. I'm spending my time writing grants instead of doing the work. Yeah. And so what carbon does, particularly with nature-based solutions, is that it gives them a long runtime without having to worry about, where's the funding going to come from. Of course, there's that element of like, we're going to sell credits. Sure. But it gives communities.
But that's where the markets are engaged, right? And so now you have to think about the timing, offtakes, liquidity events, et cetera, pricing, metrics, all that sort of stuff. But that's grown up.
And that's why you have like a dedicated arm to do that, right? Yeah. You let the community and the folks on the ground do their work. Yeah. And the reason I call this example out, which I think is one of the great contributions of the voluntary carbon market, is that it's provided a long-term kind of runway for fundamentally changing the economic drivers that people face on a day-to-day basis, and that have been baked in for centuries, right, and generations. Yeah. So to change that, you're not going to change that with a 5-year grant.
No, and you're not going to change that overnight.
Exactly. You're going to change that with sustained, inputs into changing the way we grow food and make it more intensive. Give sustained ways of developing alternative sources of livelihoods, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So that's why I think, carbon is great. Going back, I mean, this is more of the benefit and some of the outcomes. But again, once we start to realize that there's really a transformational impact that these projects are having on sectors and what they're doing for people, then you start to realize this is pretty cool. And that's why I think another element of the inevitability stands right there.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But so we're in complete agreement, which shouldn't come as a surprise, right? But I think some of the things that you said, really interesting. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is economics 101, effectively, right? We're pricing this negative externality for the first time, right, in the economy.
Yeah.
And so now that you have a price on carbon, it essentially affects the behavior of different industries and how that's happening. We're seeing that paradigm shift occur today, and it's this thematic, let's just call it, is really powerful and projected to just take decades of implementation across every sector in the world, right? And carbon pricing, whether it's allowances, whether it's baseline and credit in terms of the offset piece or a tax or a hybrid, it's being implemented. You talked about the Paris Agreement, right? And this bottom-up approach. Can you contrast that? And you also mentioned the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah. Can you contrast that with your experience? Let's rewind, kind of like when you first started in this industry, right? And then kind of like the hope around the markets at that time. Just I'd love to get that unpack that with you.
Well, I studied public policy, so I went where I studied government, and I was and continue to be a firm believer that governments can do good if they enact the right policies.
Yeah.
And so, when the Kyoto Protocol came around, I was very excited. I thought, this is great. We now have a roadmap for how it's going to work. We're going to have rules. Basically, developed countries have targets. Developing countries don't. At some point, developing countries will come on board. It'll all be sorted, and we'll all be good. In fact, when I took the job at Vera,
technocrats running the world.
Yeah, exactly. And it really is an outgrowth, kind of the fall of the Iron Curtain and all that stuff. We all thought, well, this is great. Kind of that particular challenge, worldwide challenge, is over. Now we can focus on solving the remaining world problems, right? And so we created the Kyoto Protocol, and that played out. But then it kind of ran out of steam, fell apart for a variety of reasons.
So you also mentioned earlier on, right? Political winds shift and policy changes and different. I think the dependency of the Kyoto Protocol on the EU ETS essentially was its downfall.
Yeah. But the ETS is a great example. Actually, it's working really
incredibly
well. It's really well. So they've, that's a great example because that one has taken a while, right? They had some issues, but they've been diligent about fixing them over time. And I think that's a really important lesson that we need to all draw in all sectors related to climate change.
Completely agree.
Voluntary markets included. It takes a while to implement the changes to address, the growing pains that you go through. But what I wanted to mention was, so I went to school, studied policy, thought this was it, this is great. And when I first took the job at Vera, which was then the Voluntary Carbon Standards Association, this was in 2008, I literally thought this was a 6-7 year job because Obama had been elected, and here it is, my brain thinking, great, so Obama's elected, we're going to have cap and trade in the U.S., Europe already has one, China, Australia, Japan, Korea, everybody's going to follow suit. Pretty much the whole world's going to have cap and trade. It'll all be sorted, and it's a perfect world, regulations throughout all economies. Completely. We don't need voluntary markets, right? So I kind of was working on the assumption that by 2015 latest, we were going to be able to turn the lights out, close the door,
declare victory, high five, guys.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I entered the market around that same time. 2007, we had Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. We had Obama being elected into the White House after years of the Bush administration, essentially lack of policy direction around these sorts of things. And there was this hope in the market. But then the paradigm shifted again with the financial crisis. And so throughout that time, and obviously talking my own book here, essentially, I think the voluntary market played a really interesting role. And I'm glad that it didn't peter out in that 5 and 6 year window that you were thinking about. Because essentially it's been the seat of innovation, or like the hub of innovation. That really now carbon markets, let's call it 3.0, are built on. Right? Can you unpack that for me in terms of you literally are at the
Yeah.
seat, right? Where a lot
Yeah.
of this innovation is happening, at methodologies, at a wide range of different impacts, right?
Yeah.
Basically incorporating sustainable development goals and other metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the next generation of carbon markets under the Paris Agreement,
Yeah.
right? These hybrid systems with taxes and offsets being included
Yeah.
in Colombia, in Singapore, etc. They're being built on that foundation. Don't you feel?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you feel about that legacy? And then where do you see that kind of evolving?
Well, I'm incredibly proud. And there's two kind of versions of the story, right?
Yeah.
Because one more grandiose version was that we were visionaries and we had a crystal ball and we knew exactly where it was going to go. And the more sober assessment is more that we were sitting there a bit scared, thinking that we might have made spectacularly dumb career-ending professional choices, right?
Certainly trying to explain carbon markets to my mum in those early days. She's like, so what? And I was like, yeah.
and there were some pretty dark times there. I mean, we were living off the kind of the fumes of the CDM in many ways.
No doubt.
But we did believe that natural climate solutions had a role.
Mm-hmm.
We continued to innovate. And I think that, two things happened. One, of course, was the Paris Agreement, which kind of then shifted everybody's thinking, like, oh, the tablets aren't going to come down from on high and tell us what to do.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to make it up. We've got to figure out how to operate and design and implement various different systems across the world, which is very messy, of course.
Very much so.
But
because there's so many stakeholders.
Yeah. But it is.
But it's going to be built for success as a result of that inclusion, don't you think?
Exactly. Well, I hope so. That's certainly my hope.
Yeah.
And I do see signs of that working. And I'll tell you an example.
Yeah, please. Love to hear it.
I was in Jakarta earlier this week, and I just heard one of the most inspiring stories. And so I was speaking to a young man, and he is part of a family business that has a palm oil concession.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been running it for, I think, decades. And they still have part of the forest that's left intact. There's like 30 or 40 orangutans still living there.
Yep.
And he's young. He's much more conscious about the environment that our generation was. And he said, we're not going to chop it down. Like, I don't want to chop it down. Much to the horror of his family and, of course, his mother-in-law. And so he starts looking around, like, how can I avoid cutting down this remaining forest, which I understand there's some economic value, and that's what we've been doing for generations, but I don't want to do it. So he looks around, he finds carbon, and he says, great. So he starts persevering and figures out that he's got a great carbon project, right? And he's going to be developing it. And so now he's reached an agreement with his family. Everybody's okay. He's going to conserve it. They're all happy. His mother-in-law is now behind him, which is great. And so now you have a success story. And it's these kind of signals that we're sending to folks like that that are starting to change how we think about the future. And I just found that tremendously inspiring. Yeah. And I think that's part of what markets do, right? You send signals. You say, look, here's an opportunity. There's nobody offering any money to keep that forest standing. That's a concession. That is planned to be deforested and replaced with palm oil.
Yep.
And we know the environmental consequences of that.
Completely. In terms of biodiversity,
exactly.
Yeah.
So here's a market working, doing exactly what it needs to be doing.
I think that's a really interesting story, because I've also been fortunate enough to actually go to projects and see them firsthand.
Yeah.
Projects as diverse as in Kenya, right, where there's essentially protecting like wildlife, right, like really important big game, right, and basically providing revenue streams to communities that are essentially now protecting custodians of that land. Seeing the same thing in Latin America, in Guatemala, for example. I went there with a large airline client with a film crew to actually document the impacts on the ground. And we spoke to indigenous communities that benefited from the finance that was coming from these projects and just transformational things. So, for example, mobile clinics that target the indigenous communities, in particular, the women in those communities that benefit from that stream that's coming in from the purchase of those offsets. It's a story that's not often told. But that's you were talking about the kind of the optimism of the youth, right? I feel like I'm buoyed every day by the kind of energy of the new entrants into this market, whether they're older folks or younger folks that are coming in from diverse fields. I think the one trait that we all have is this optimism right? We're pragmatists at heart
Yeah.
because we have to like dig in and actually do.
Mhm.
So I don't think like said like maybe we're thinking it's going to be all rainbows and unicorns and stuff. No, it's like pragmatic. We're going to have to delve into the hard work.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there's a goal that we're driving towards.
Yeah.
And it's essentially putting our work and our effort over decades, essentially, and ultimately leaving a legacy around reducing emissions long term, right? Yeah. And then the flow-on effects is that there's positive impact to those communities. So that's the kind of the fuel that I use on a daily basis to continue to do what we do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
How do you feel about that? Because obviously you've empowered that, right? To the tunes of billions of dollars of finance going through. Because Vera had reached last year a milestone that's incredible. 1 billion tons of VCUs that have been issued since inception over a 15-year period.
Yeah.
And effectively we saw that increment over time and then accelerate. And now I would imagine that we'll hit a 2 billion mark, not in a too distant future.
Yeah.
Multiply that out by the dollars per ton.
Right.
That's significant flows of finance going to projects on the ground.
Yeah.
It's pretty impactful, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's where I draw my inspiration from, quite frankly.
That's the well.
Yeah, exactly. I care deeply about this, and knowing that you've got these projects that are being implemented on the ground with consultations and stakeholders and communities and indigenous communities. I mean, it's just like that to me is what really motivates me, knowing that they're actually working and changing the trajectory of those local economies to actually protect the forest or restore the forest or whatever it may be, or even it plays out even in other technology sectors, that you've got that level of engagement at the very kind of on the ground level, and to know that we're helping to drive those changes is what really kind of inspired and motivated me. And every time I talk to a project developer or I know of a trade that's happening with this project, I always go and look to see what's the project's about, and it's just the array of inspiring stories is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it is. Because you mentioned something earlier, and kind of just on this theme, if I can pull this thread around the impact of people on the ground, and especially in the global south. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, you were born in Mexico, right? I'd love to understand your perspective as essentially having grown up there, and essentially what influence, like that context around your youth has been spent in essentially a developing country has had around shaping your narrative and your journey. Can you give us some context there?
I was born and raised in Mexico, and I've of American parents. But when people ask me, how do you feel? I say, well, I've got American blood but a Mexican heart. So I feel very, very close to Mexico. I grew up there. I mean, curiously enough, when I went to school, even though I went to the American school, all my friends were always Mexican. I always like understood and bonded with the Mexican culture really well. But one of the features of my growing up was that I lived a very privileged life. We lived well, but I was very conscious of the disparity in wealth and income across society, and I saw that every day. I was like, you see it when you're driving through a poor neighborhood. When you see it, when even from a building you look at the neighborhood behind, you see it. It's very clear, very palpable.
It's abrupt and it's there.
And it had an impact on me, and I don't know why it did. It just did. And I've always felt that that we could do better as a society at making sure that everybody's pulled up. So. Yeah, but that's been kind of usually my family thinks I'm crazy. Kind of the focus on the environmental stuff and stuff. But I do have a bit of a different perspective on the fact that I think that we should be better about helping to distribute the wealth. And in this, when it plays out in my work today, it's like if we can help drive that finance to the folks who really need it and could really use it, I think it's a tremendous contribution.
I completely agree. I mean, I was also born in the global south. I was born in Colombia, in Bogota, and I saw that same just reality. It was a very unsafe country at the time with a lot of just turmoil, right? Just the political, but also just the economic kind of turmoil. And there was other contexts around drug wars, etc. I was really fortunate, like you, and have had the perspective of living in 4 different continents now, and now I reside here in Asia, and see that disparity, right? That on a daily basis when you travel throughout. Singapore is a very fortunate existence, right? So we live in this essentially this bubble, right? But I never forget that the transformative kind of influences, right, and experiences in your life that ultimately lead us to where we are. So kind of taking that thread, right? So you grew up in Mexico, and then when did you move back to the United States?
I moved in, so I went away to boarding school, but then my father passed away when I was 17.
Okay.
So my dad was kind of the Latin American one. He was Italian, moved to Peru, but then went to college in the U.S. and then married my mom, who's American. So when my dad passed, my mom moved back to the U.S.
Right.
So I moved moved to the U.S.
Moved to the U.S. Back, but sure.
Yeah, when I was 17.
Okay.
So then I spent all my, college, work, graduate school, and then I went back to Mexico to work for USAID.
Okay. So you're at grad school, and then you end up at USAID. What created that impetus? Like, how did you find that from your undergraduate to postgrad to ultimately finding your first job in a similar industry, right? Like in policy, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I always, since college, I always felt like I want to do something like positive for the world. I mean, there was kind of this underlying desire that I wanted to do that. And so I went to work for a grassroots advocacy organization right out of college. And I worked there for 3 years, had a great time. Had a bit of an aha moment when, in 1990, I think it was, when the acid rain program was passed in the U.S. And this is this emissions trading system where the government said, okay, you guys can, here's your limit for emissions. If you go below, you can sell your extra allowances to the other companies. And I was outraged. I thought this was like the end of civilization. Like, we're allowing companies to pollute. I was morally outraged. I thought this was the worst thing we could do. And I remember sitting with my colleagues, and we were just, foaming at the mouth, thinking this was the worst thing ever. But then I don't know what it was, but something like in my head said, hang on a bit, check this. Why is this happening? I mean, if the U.S. government, pretty important government in the world, is doing this to solve this problem, what's behind it? Could it work? Might it make sense? So I decided to then go to graduate school. I went to grad school and studied government, public policy, and focused on environment and sustainable development, right? So it was about kind of both. I've always been those two angles. Again, I've always really cared about the environment, but again, I think probably from my roots in Mexico, I've always cared about that development piece.
Yeah.
And so then after that, I worked for a consulting company. Interesting, but it was kind of a desk job of doing assessments, cost-benefit analyses of policies, which
fundamentals.
Fundamentals,
but maybe your heart wasn't in it.
Yeah, but then a friend of mine said, "Hey, I'm doing some really cool work for the UN and US EPA, working with automotive service shop technicians, helping them get CFC recovery and recycling equipment." I was like, well, that's cool. He's like, I need someone who's got kind of organizing skills, like
it's a perfect confluence of different experiences,
Spanish,
right? Yeah.
And understands this. I'm like, great, I'm your man.
Dude, that's me.
So I went and had a great time. We worked in projects all over Latin America, Asia, Africa. Very cool program. And then, it ended up happening to be at that same company, ICF. I then ended up being on the auditing team for one of the first large-scale greenhouse gas projects, which was distributing 2.5, 5 million, I can't remember the number, but millions of compact fluorescent light bulbs to replace incandescent light bulbs. And our job was to assess what was the environmental impact, right? How do you measure the impact of this intervention?
Yep.
And then, through that, I found this opportunity to work for USAID in Mexico as the Global Climate Change Advisor. 1999, I'm thinking, great, Al Gore's likely to be elected. I'm going to go to Mexico and actually help establish the emissions trading system between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. By then, of course, I drank the Kool-Aid. I kind of had understood the fundamentals of emissions trading. And
the economics, the imperatives here around price indexionality, etc.
Exactly.
It's a very rational kind of approach, right? Sometimes it's a little bit cerebral. I don't think we communicate it effectively.
Yeah.
But I mean, you mentioned the acid rain program. When we look back, and you're talking about solar, right? In terms of how effective that's been and kind of renewables. That's another really great example of a policy shift that ultimately affected behavior. Because incentives drive behavior. Like we're humans. We need to have these incentives in order to change, right? I mean, so that's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you're there, and then what was the next step?
Well, then
Your SID.
I'm a USID. I'm very excited.
Yep.
George Bush gets elected, and my role, talking about government shifts,
Mm-hmm.
like, well, we're not doing that much mitigation anymore. We're going to focus our attention on adaptation.
Right.
So I lost interest, and I ended up leaving, and I got a job at EcoSecurities.
Okay, great. So one of the pioneering and kind of
Pioneering.
seminal firms of the carbon market.
Yes, exactly.
And you were there essentially in the very, very early days.
Yeah, I wasn't, Pedro and Mark Stewart, who were the founders,
Yeah.
I had brought in the CEO, Bruce Usher, and, there was already kind of an important company in the sector.
Completely.
So by the time I got there,
What year was that?
2003,
2003. Okay.
right?
So here, for context, we've got Kyoto Protocol 97, and ultimately EU ETS and CDM starting to take
Yeah.
off and make some waves.
Yeah. So Kyoto
Really
Protocol
just-
gets ratified in
Yep.
2005,
Mhm.
right? And then off to the races. So then I, spent years there, started managing the consulting business, but then I ran a joint venture
Yep.
with a biogas company, a landfill gas company.
Cool.
So we worked together to develop landfill gas projects throughout the world. And so basically I know many landfills around the world.
Yeah, right.
Which actually turned out to be, in many of the cases, aren't landfills, but they're actually dump sites.
Yeah.
Right? And that was one of the kind of another realization, like, wow, we go to the landfill in Lagos, Nigeria.
Mhm.
It's a pretty hard
Pretty
thing
harsh.
to absorb.
Yeah, I can imagine.
There's people
Yeah.
living on landfill.
Mhm.
You can't put pipes in. There's no real way to implement the project. So
Mhm.
it's pretty, it was a very successful venture because we found a number of good deals.
Yep.
But it wasn't, the opportunity wasn't as big as we thought. But anyway, still very successful, and I had a great time. But then, the CDM was starting to lose steam as well.
Mhm.
And then the volunteer markets were coming around. So I was involved in some of the early development of those and participated as EcoSecurities. Mark Stewart, one of the founders of EcoSecurities, was involved in the BCF steering committee.
Okay.
So he brought me and a number of our colleagues in to help with some parts of the program, and I got really interested in it. And
So that's carbon markets 2.0, right?
Yeah.
I call it, right? So now it's a development of these standards.
Yeah.
So you were there at basically the crucible of that moment.
Yeah.
Take me through that. Like, how was that experience? I mean, you were essentially building it from a foundation of basically nothing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, no, there had been a interim CEO. It was Edwin Alders.
Mhm.
There was an interim program officer, Josh Harris. And they did a great job, but they were moonlighting. So they were kind of, trying to keep the things afloat, but things were starting to get really serious. So I was brought on, and so was Jerry Seeger. We were the kind of first two employees. And it was like literally, start from scratch. The first thing I had to do, like my first assignment, was negotiate the registry agreements, which was like not
easy.
Not easy.
Mhm.
And remember, we had that multiple registry.
You had
system.
duality. You had IHS market, and effectively, was it APX at the time, or were they NYSE
AP,
Blue?
No, it was APX.
Okay.
It was IHS. Well, it wasn't even market. It was
Yeah.
just TZ1, right, from
Right.
New Zealand, and it was CDC because it did both from France.
Okay.
So there was three. I had to negotiate those three agreements. Of course, they had to all be the same because we
Mhm.
couldn't be preferential to one or the other. And I had to negotiate kind of a database management
Mhm.
agreement as well. So that was the first thing that landed on my plate.
Wow.
So that was not, that was like, okay, this is serious.
Mhm.
I remember it was at Poznan at the COP. I spent half my time in the room like trying to sort this out. But anyway, so yeah, it was like full on. And, all of the team before me had done a good job of preparing the rules and
The
program
governance
and
framework.
kind of the
Yep.
general structure.
Mhm.
But we had to build it from scratch. We had to build, the whole, process for how you actually develop a project, how you submit it,
Mhm.
how we review it, how we work with the auditors, the VVBs, all that stuff we had to kind of build. And so we slowly built the team,
Mhm.
and we kind of hit that 20-person threshold, and I remember talking to somebody who said, yeah, organizations, they get to 20, 25, and they either die or they explode.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking,
That's really prescient.
I wonder
actually. Huh.
where we're going to go. Yeah, this is interesting. I don't know if this is based on, a number of management studies or whatever, but it does seem that at that level, you're starting to kind of deal with a level of complexity.
Complete, because it's an organism now, right? With multiple
Yeah.
kind of like nexus points and people with their ownership of that, and they want to have an impact and take it in terms of direction. I felt that exact same thing within CBL. Right? It's interesting you mentioned that 20 people threshold. I remember when we were 19 people, and I was like, it was perfect. Right? But exactly, it felt this could go to the moon or it could not. It's interesting how then it evolves, and then you just have to let it go, right? Kind of trust in the process. So so then it goes from 3 registries, and ultimately what you did is essentially build the infrastructure, right, on which the market now and the markets of the future are built upon. Because essentially standards, registries, they're intertwined, and it's essentially the ledger that's tracing all of the transactions, and essentially provides the record of ownership for these units, and then underlies the governance process, because up until the project is ultimately issued, it's still in the pipeline for approval. Okay, so then can we fast forward? So famously, Vera shifted from, ultimately ended up being 2 registries at the time, APX and IHS market. And then you basically harmonized to just have one registry provider. But very interestingly, Vera becoming the registry administrator. That was an interesting time to be in the market and to see that shift. Can you walk me through it from your perspective? Because it feels like the standard bit a lot off that you could chew, essentially. How was that from an experience perspective?
I mean, by then we had a good team, and so the process was pretty smooth. I mean, there was obviously some things with data not coming over, all that stuff, and that's kind of to be expected. But the transition was really smooth. I think the interesting thing to me was that we had to kind of bury this thought that was embedded from the very beginning. In fact, when my time at EcoSecurities, the thing that EcoSecurities had brought to the table in terms of the steering committee of the VCS was the registry. And I think this whole idea of a multi-registry system was we cooked it up. And we did it, I think, with the view that at some point you needed to have kind of, sales people, right, if you will, or people who were close to the project developers, where you basically go to, like if you're in Indonesia, you'd want to go to someone who's close to you. If you're in Africa or Latin America, you'd want to go, to
like a localized kind of model,
like a localized service, if you will. That was my view of it, at least. But it didn't really turn out that way, and CDC soon kind of didn't make an aggressive move to be a real player. So it ended up being really APX and Market, who then bought TZ1. And so we operated that for a while, but it became really clunky. Right?
I remember it because you had to have these intra transfers between registries, and it was like tedious, and it felt like there was very tribal. You'd have on the trade side, right? I'd have a client who was adamant that they were an APX client, and then on the other side it'd be an IHS client, and essentially they would negotiate a price, but there'd be this delta, and effectively now we have to move product between, and you have to kind of play peacemaker, and it was just too tedious.
Exactly. And so from our perspective as a standard setter, anytime we wanted to make a change, we had to go to APX, and we had to get to market. If one of them didn't like it, we had to go back, and it just became really
It's really political.
And then, we started implementing a lot of changes. And so it became, from a legal perspective, really costly, and it just didn't make sense. But I think that was one of your presentations, actually, that kind of flipped the switch for me.
Really?
I never told you this.
Oh, wow.
So I think we were in Washington, D.C., and you were presenting, it was in front of Airlines for America, A4A.
Right, A4A. Okay.
And you
I remember that.
And you had a slide that showed, here are the registries. And the registries were the Climate Action Reserve Registry, the Gold Standard Registry, and the APX Vera Registry. And I was like, wait a minute. Why is Renee talking about the APX? It's our registry, but the branding, right?
Yeah, it was separated. There was this duality. They were at front of house as opposed to back of house.
Exactly. And it was like, this is just too confusing. I mean, we're adding another layer of confusion to the market. I thought, this is not good.
Wow, so I planted the seed, like an inception moment.
Exactly. That was like a real aha moment for me. It's like, wait a minute, the market isn't clear that this is our registry, and it was. We just direct APX and market to follow these instructions. And so we decided, you know what, this is too. The other piece that was happening at the time was that we were starting to develop. So we incorporated the climate community biodiversity standards. I don't know where we were in the development of SD Vista. I think we might have already been thinking about plastics. So we thought, if we're going to be having, the idea behind Vera is to be kind of the central, one of the central areas where you have environmental instruments. And we thought, do we want to recreate the same mechanism for these other assets?
Yeah.
And we thought, I don't think so. This makes more sense for us to hold and own and manage.
Yeah.
Full stop. So,
but that's the evolution of Vera as well, right? Because you famously said before, right? You started off as the voluntary carbon standard, then it became the verified carbon standard, and there's folks obviously that we know who are just adamant around trying to change that nomenclature, right? We're a verified carbon market. I love that stance, and Rich Gilmore, I give him credit for that. but he's building on that experience. But then you changed it to Vera so that it became an overarching standard body to incorporate the CCB, SD Vista, VCS, and now the plastics. And it's this kind of evolution around how do we price and take these same sort of principles, right? Pricing the externality, negative or positive, and ultimately trying to create incentives to drive financial flows to that, where they can make impact. So, but now it's this big governance kind of structure, right? With multiple kind of tentpoles.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting kind of transition.
Yeah.
How has that been from an organizational perspective, right? Because now you've got, how many people do you have at Vera? You went from 20? 140.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, now we've started to really create, systems and procedures. That's kind of why we brought Judith Simon on board, right? So at some point, we had this realization that the organization is really growing, and we have all these different systems, all these different processes, procedures. And so we needed to have someone who can understand how you actually drive operational excellence throughout the entire organization. And that wasn't me. I mean, I got to say that that's not my skill set.
Okay.
And so we brought Judith Simon on board, and she's done operational excellence at large technology companies, right? So she knows how to think about this stuff and how you actually drive that operational excellence. So now we have, we talk about the registry. We always had a registry team. And that team still exists. And so, but now it's still operating within the program management department. But there's some changes she's implementing to make sure that things run more smoothly. And so, now we're handling just such a huge volume of requests.
Oh, no doubt.
And the challenge has been to kind of try to keep up with them
and operationalize.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. Okay, so that you just basically address the elephant in the room, right? Which is essentially this transition, right? And it's essentially when I received your email, and when ultimately then you published that around that announcement that essentially after 15 years, David Antonioli is leaving Vera. There's like this tectonic kind of moment. I emailed you straight away, right? I was in New York. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I'm so happy for you as a friend, and I'm curious to understand what's next. But let's park that for a second. But you mentioned Judith, right? So she's coming in now. It's kind of a lot of kind of self-awareness. You just described essentially you were critical for the growth of the standard to now become what it is today. It's transformed. You've just given us the kind of overview of that.
Thank you.
But now you recognize that you're not necessarily best placed to kind of lead it to the next level. So then you're essentially abdicating that power. That's not that common, let's just say, in organizations, because it's always like, it's hard to let go of your baby, ultimately.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
It is.
So unpack that bit for me, and then also I'd like to understand, kind of the advice that you have for Judith kind of going forward, because ultimately she's now owning that.
Yeah.
So can you tell me about how does this feel? It must be bittersweet.
Yeah, it is. It's very bittersweet. I mean, I have tremendously strong feelings for Vera and all the staff. I mean, I just feel like I really helped create this organization.
You created a family.
Yeah, and
that's the feeling I get for folks that were at Vera and then have gone on to different careers and different roles. They still wear it as a badge of honor, right? Like that's part of who they are. They're very much a family.
Yeah.
Right?
We've got just a very close team. Even at 140, there's a real sense of camaraderie and collegiality amongst all the staff. And that's one, thing I go away with thinking, wow, this is great. I helped build an organization where people feel happy, despite the fact that it's stressful, that there's a ton of work, and that,
And it feels like sometimes those folks are underappreciated.
Yes.
It feels like from the outside looking in, I'm just thinking, talent has been an incredible headwind for you guys, because you incubate these people and then the industry kind of just steals them from you. And it's just really frustrating to see. And then the same industry folks saying, oh, well, there's inefficiencies at Vera. It's like, you literally pinched their team. Like, can we have a moratorium where nobody touches the Vera folks? And there is a gentleman's and ladies agreement kind of that I help to kind of have with some folks. We're just like, hey, let's not
Yeah.
do that, right? Because ultimately we're
Yeah.
undermining the integrity of the market
Yeah.
long term. But anyway, I digress.
But an important point on that one, I think you captured it right there, that the team is, greatly underappreciated. And sometimes they're really under the gun.
Yeah.
And so folks who get upset that they're not getting their projects back. But what we have learned is in the last, year and a half or two, is that the quality of the documentation isn't necessarily what it should be when it comes on our desk.
Right.
So, the
So
team...
effectively going back to the PD in this case.
Exactly. You go back to the project description. Say, And I'll give you an example. There was a developer of a red project.
Yep.
Who was not his first time around the block, and he was calling and saying, "Hey, where's my project approval? I need it. It's got deadlines."
Yeah, because you've got guys on the other side, like
Exactly.
my guys or
Yep.
someone else's, is saying, "Hey, we've got this under contract."
And so I said, "Okay, I usually don't look at it, talk to the team, but this was an experienced developer. I thought, well, maybe something's wrong here." So I did a spot check essentially, and so I looked at the PR, the project review report that my team sent back to the VVB, the auditor, and there was like 23 findings that we had, and I looked at them. I was like, they're all legit.
They're all
But
material.
one of them was astounding to me. So this is a red project, right?
Yep.
One of the key things you've got to look at red is like, what's the leakage, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to protect this area, what's the risk, or how are you going to measure that the drivers of deforestation aren't going elsewhere?
Yeah.
Key element for integrity.
Yep.
This project developer said, oh, on leakage, zero leakage, no justification. So this does not compute, right? So my team caught that. My point in telling the story is that in this particular case, the VVB should have caught that.
Yeah.
And the developer who's been around the block should have known that this was a red flag.
Yeah.
And yet it went from the developer to the VVB to my team's desk. And it was us who had to say, let's send it back. So, I think that the team is underappreciated because they catch this stuff all the time.
But that's the checks and balances. That's why people trust the standard, right?
Exactly.
You talk about integrity.
Yep.
Ultimately, that's what governance does, right?
Yeah.
It creates checks and balances, and ultimately projects need to adhere to that framework, and ultimately then get a pass.
Yes.
It's binary. You either get a pass or you don't.
Exactly.
You go back to the drawing board and you get rejected, or you get through, right?
Yeah.
But in the market side, and essentially also from taking it on really as a fiduciary responsibility to my clients, whether they be airlines or industrials, the buyers of these units, I need to stake my reputation on the fact that I trust that the standard is doing its job.
Exactly.
And I feel that.
Yeah.
That has never been sort of undermined in my view.
That's
right? And that's, I think, a testament to why Vera is regarded where it
Yeah.
is as the dominant standard in the marketplace.
Mhm.
So I'm glad to
Yeah.
see that that's actually in action. So thank you for sharing.
No, it is. So anyway, the point is, the staff work really hard, and so they do great work, and they're really committed to the organization. So back to your earlier question, I feel like I got to a point where I felt confident that the work is being done. That's a good example.
Yeah.
And that the organization needs new blood. I mean, everything needs new blood,
energy.
right? New energy.
Yep.
And so, we hired Judith to hit the ground running.
Awesome.
She's interim CEO. I think the board has to decide what they do.
Sure.
Like, what's her role? Because she does not have the technical expertise. So the organization has to figure that part out. But in terms of operations, which I think is in many ways where the organization is shifted to, right? So we'll still continue to do a lot of innovation and helping to build the market. But I think it's more now about making sure that the systems and the procedures, everything works like clockwork.
Yeah.
And so we need to develop.
You need professional management effectively of how that goes.
Yeah.
That's not too different for our experience, right? Essentially, I was talking about this last night at a McKinsey event, right, with some of the partners there. And, I've been really fortunate in my experience to join CBL when we were a startup, right? And essentially, fast forward a year or so, we did a management buyout, et cetera. But we started basically from scratch, and we rebuilt on goodwill and just good design, right, around what we wanted to achieve in terms of building the infrastructure. And like you said, there's this kind of shift when we were from like 18, 19 people, and then all of a sudden, fast forward, and now we're like 300 or thereabouts. And it feels like there's this exponential growth and this kind of the energy and momentum of the people that owned that first moment. And then it's the kind of the next stage. Do you feel that kind of you're cresting And what's the next stage to essentially ensure that there's a long-term viability of the business and effectively bringing in folks with experience, with perspective from different like industries, and have kind of seen this movie before in a different kind of cinema. Let's just sort of, to mix an analogy here, right? But effectively, like now we have that in terms of our board structure. We have institutional investors. There's a different governance structure. So it's grown up essentially. And it's interesting to kind of be in that, right? Because there's a push and pull, but you have to kind of trust in that process and kind of let it evolve. So that's really interesting. Yeah. So can I ask you the kind of $1 million question? So
sure.
What's next for you? Like
that $1 million question.
That $1 million question. Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious. Honestly, I told a few friends that we were doing this, and that was the question that they kept asking. They're like, "Hey, what's going to happen next?" Because again, we've been such a small industry, and it's so intimate, right? We've kind of all grown up in this space, right? But I've been in it for 15 plus years. So have you, right? And essentially, we've seen the ebbs and flows, right? And a lot of the folks that have just endured, we've built camaraderie, we've built connectivity, even though we're competitors, but it's just like respect amongst, amongst one another. And so, you as a person have this, magnetic kind of charisma, and you've been, it's true. And so you've been the face of Vera for a long time. So it's difficult for folks to disassociate the standard from David. But like you said, it's the right time. But then the question is, well, what's going to happen to our friend?
Also, I'm still here.
You're still here, yeah?
I'm not going anywhere.
You're not going to just ride off on a sailboat into the Caribbean?
If I had money, I might. But that's not the case. And I still got plenty of energy to do so.
Sure.
But, I mean, I don't have anything planned.
Good.
The only short-term thing I've got work-wise is to kind of serve as an advisor during the transition to the board.
Great.
And I don't have anything planned. I mean, I'm
You're taking time off to spend with your family?
I am hoping to take the summer off.
Great.
So I'm taking a long vacation with my family immediately after finishing.
Because how old are your kids, if you don't mind?
Sophia is 16 and Danny is 14. So they're a great age, and they've been very supportive. So is my wife. She's been great. So we have a great vacation. They've got a couple of things during the summer, which I will be basically chilling out.
Yep.
I have a backpacking trip with a bunch of old college grad school friends.
Nice. Where are you guys going?
Probably Wyoming.
Oh, cool.
We got 3 options. We're trying to decide.
Yeah.
But probably Wyoming. So that'll be fun.
Nice.
And I'm still on the payroll technically until the 30th of September. Because I have so much holiday and sabbatical accumulated that I've not been able to take. So I'm still financially doing okay until the end of September. So I don't have to worry too much about paying the bills. But, come September, I want to take some time and just think and reflect. I mean, I've been on the hamster wheel for 15 years.
Yep.
And, I'm like a dog. I'm very loyal. So I never really entertained any offers that came to the door.
Yeah. But now's the time to do that.
It's now
you just have to evaluate to see what is actually where your heart's at, right?
Exactly. And I want to be able to, do something that I think does, moves the needle on climate or the environment somehow. I don't know what that will be. But I also thought that, kind of like the trajectory of my life, I thought, if I want to stay at Vera forever and retire at Vera, I thought, I got a few gigs left in me. Yeah. So, and again, given the situation in the organization, being stable, having competent leadership, and it's not just Judith, it's like the team
all the way through.
We now have a chief communications officer. She's fantastic. We now have a new program management officer, chief program manager, who's fantastic, comes from Fair Trade. Yeah. We got Toby and Robin and Will. Yeah. So the team has kind of, we got a full suite of really capable chief officers to support Judith. So I kind of felt like,
let them shine.
Let them shine. Let them do their own thing.
Yeah, awesome.
Craft their own future.
That's leadership 101 right there.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, it is as hard as it is.
As hard as it is to let go, but it is, right?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah,
good. I'm happy for you, man.
Thank you.
And I really just want to say thank you because I don't know. It feels like the next few months are going to be transformational for you. I'm really glad that you're going to take some time just to reflect and kind of see what comes to you, right? I'm a believer in kind of karmic energy and kind of a balance sheet. Just kind of be open to it and essentially see what comes, right? You've got to enjoy your family because ultimately that's who we work for. That's what we're here on this planet for, right? Kind of seeing them grow. I'm a father of a 3-year-old and my daughter is my entire life. She's my reason for existing, right? And so she's the well that I draw from in terms of energy in terms of what I want to leave for her in terms of a legacy.
Yeah.
Right. And for her to be proud of me. Right. But
Yeah.
ultimately, we need to sometimes stop and take some time.
Yeah.
Right. So that's really important. I'm happy for you on
Yeah.
that front.
Well,
And
thank you.
hopefully, the next bit is going to be really exciting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope this
Cool.
wasn't the most financially ruinous decision ever, but we'll see.
I'm sure it won't. Well, coming back to the inevitability that we all kind of sense in the carbon markets, I mean, I think that there's long-term here opportunities, and I know you'll be like number one, like free agent for folks to target. So I think there'll be some good opportunities around the corner.
Right.
And if not, call me.
Okay.
I know some
You can hook
folks.
me up.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad that you're my first guest.
Yeah, well,
for that.
thank you. Thank
So
you. It's
appreciate
been a
it,
pleasure.
man. Yeah.
No, thank
Welcome
you
to
for being
Singapore, and I'm
Yeah.
really excited for the next challenge ahead for you.
Well, thank you. Thank
Thanks.
you. No, really, my pleasure.
I've enjoyed this
It's been
tremendously.
great.
So
Yeah,
thank you.
you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Thanks. Gracias.
Aquí.
Right.